Snow can bury a road, and it can erase the rules we think keep us safe. When the world goes white and the wind drowns out ordinary sounds, thresholds, front doors, porches, mountain ridges become places where decisions stop feeling normal and danger slides in under the same quiet blanket. These are 3 first-person accounts of exactly that. A move to a remote house in South Dakota where a neighbor becomes something else. A late-night knock in upstate New York where footprints don't add up. And a backcountry run in British Columbia where a helping hand disappears into the drift. All 3 happened during blizzards. All 3 left more questions than answers. Story 1. The Neighbor, South Dakota. I didn't plan to scare myself. I wanted the opposite. I wanted quiet, a place with miles of sky and the kind of silence you only get where there are no streetlights and no late-night deliveries. I left a city job, packed a truck with the essentials, and took a small clapboard house on a stretch of county road that on good days saw maybe 1 car an hour. The house sat alone, a porch sagging under winter weight, a woodpile someone's parent had stacked years ago. It was the kind of place that felt like it belonged to you and to wind and to time. The first week was everything I imagined. Mornings were bright and sharp. My breath fogged the windows into soft ghosts. The only sounds were my boots and the distant call of a hawk. I learned the rhythm of snow, how it settled when a front came in, how quickly a cleared driveway could turn back into a white trap. There were neighbors, technically, sparse, polite people who waved from long driveways when the plow passed, but I saw them rarely. One name kept coming up, in half questions and dropped tones. Joe. People said he kept to himself mostly. They said he had a bad patch, years back, something about his wife and a disappearance no one could explain. They didn't say it like an accusation. They said it like a wound they didn't open. When the blizzard came, it came fast. I woke to a house that sounded different, thick outside, the wind a low, hungry thing scratching the siding. My truck, which I'd parked facing the road, refused to be a truck that morning. Snow had wrapped it like a shroud. The front door latch froze. My fingers went numb trying to feel the key. I thought I could ride it out, confident in boots and canned food, until the generator hiccuped and I realized I couldn't get the truck unstuck on my own. I called the only neighbor I knew by sight, the only one whose driveway even showed a faint tire mark. Joe answered on the second ring. His voice was the kind you can place immediately. Middle-aged, hoarse from cold or cigarettes, I couldn't tell. He said, "Come over." He said nothing about the storm, like storms were mundane and nobody needed to comment on them. I loaded a backpack, crossed the porch that suddenly felt very small, and walked into the white. The road was already instinctless, no visibility beyond a house or 2. The world had become a smear of grey and wind and the steady slap of snow against my face. Joe's house was closer than I'd thought, or perhaps the storm made everything feel nearer. He opened the door without much ceremony and let me in. He moved around his kitchen like someone who had practiced being in the same small rectangles of light for decades. The stove, the table, the threadbare couch. He offered coffee and I accepted, fingers wrapped around a mug more for heat than taste. There was something off about him, but it wasn't a single thing you could point at. He stared too long at the window. He spoke in tangents and didn't always finish. He kept asking the same question. "You come from far?" It wasn't mean. It was empty, like a space he repeated into to find shape. When he laughed, the laugh wasn't quite in his throat. He paced the kitchen while I sat, not quite pacing, more wandering in a circle. He would stop, put his hands on the counter, and look at me like he was trying to decide what I was for. He insisted I stay the night. "Can't send you out there," he said. "Road's bad." There was no menacing inflection, just a certainty that carried weight. I should have declined. I didn't. I slept on his couch because the idea of trudging back through the storm to a house with frozen locks felt worse than sleeping in a stranger's living room. He made room for me like a man who had always been expecting company he would never get. He moved the lamp, fussed with the blanket, and left a screen door unlocked, as if anyone might come in the night. At some point after midnight, something woke me. It was a noise that did not belong in a one-story house. Heavy, soft feet, as if someone were walking above me on rafters that didn't exist. The house had no second floor. I lay still and listened as the steps moved across the ceiling, a slow, deliberate tread. I remember thinking it might be the house itself settling, some quirk of cold wood and ice. But the rhythm of it, 2 steps, stop, 3 steps, stop, felt measured. The kind of measurement you give when you are practicing how to do something in secret. Joe wasn't in the living room when I opened my eyes. The lamp was on, the TV muted but glowing, casting a rectangle of blue that did not touch the ceiling. The front door was closed. My phone had no signal. I told myself I was being silly. I told myself the old wood had learned to talk, and the wind was making it say things. The sound came again, louder now, like someone had taken a shoe off and was slapping the floor with it. Then the front door opened. Not the step-and-shut whisper of someone leaving, a wide, decisive intake of the door, and someone filling the frame. The silhouette moved without light, no shadow on the snow, no comment from outside air. A weight landed on me before my brain could register who it was. He tackled me from behind with a force I didn't expect. Hands clamped around my throat like iron. He muttered something into my ear that made my skin ice over even quicker than the room. "She'll find me good company," he said. Or maybe it was, "She's not going to be happy." The words were mumbled, edged with that same uncertain humor I'd heard earlier, but under them lay a hunger that had nothing to do with storm or warmth. My lungs burned from the pressure. For a moment the room spun in slow, sick arcs, and the muffled ceiling steps kept time with my heartbeat. I didn't know if I should bite, scream, pray. Everything felt wrong and raw. Instinct took me instead. I kicked hard, found space around his arms, elbowed his side. One small move, then another. Maybe he was slow from drink, maybe he was sluggish from winter, maybe he moved with the tired cruelty of someone who'd been practicing this in the dark for years. He cursed. The sound was animal and immediate. I rolled, something clipped the lamp, and the room went sideways for a flash. I scrambled, cold and panicked and furious in equal measure, and pushed toward the back door that opened into a porch with a light that looked like daylight through a frosted lens. I ran into the storm with nothing but the jacket I'd worn, my breath tearing out of me like paper. Snow hit my face like thrown flour. My hands were numb. I didn't look back. To this day I don't know how long I ran. I knew only that when I hit the yard of the house 2 miles down the road, Kathy and Brandon's place, they were on their porch like 2 angels I'd never expected to know. They pulled me into their warm kitchen before I could finish a sentence. Wrapped towels around my chilled fingers, sat me by a stove that hummed like a small insistence of safety. They were the sort of people who had waited out blizzards before. They did not ask many questions at first. They gave me hot broth, let me throw a wet coat on a chair, and let the story fall out in pieces. The frozen lock, the truck, Joe's house, the steps that weren't there. Kathy's face hardened when I mentioned Joe. Brandon said nothing, just brought another blanket. They listened to the rhythm of my breathing and the raggedness of the story. When I finished, Kathy's mouth twisted in a way that meant she believed me and hated that she did. The next morning, the police came, or at least a man with a badge, who came after we'd called. He listened longer than I wanted him to, and asked questions that forced me to make sentences out of fear. He kept his distance when I used Joe's name. He used the words suspected and alleged like small, cold knives. I learned that Joe had been whispered about for years, that neighbors remembered arguments muffled by curtains, that one winter they'd noticed his wife's car gone, and then they'd noticed less. No clear answers, no body, nothing to hang a conviction on. People had talked, people had looked away. The sheriff said they would check on Joe, do what they could in a storm. The sheriff's voice had the kind of calm you use when you aren't sure you can help. They checked Joe's house. The house itself looked the same, stupidly ordinary. Curtains, a porch light, a mailbox that leant slightly to the left. There were no footprints leading away from the house that night, or at least none that survived the drifts. At some point, the deputies left with promises that sounded like paper. The town wasn't a place where claims were easily solved. Snow erased and delayed things in equal measure. I moved in with Kathy and Brandon for a while. The town folded me in like a scarf. They took me driving past Joe's place sometimes, as if proximity could stitch sense to fear. He was always there in the window, the way people are when you can't stop looking at them. He'd be out on the porch or inside, or not at all. Sometimes I couldn't say. When I passed his driveway, the wind seemed to go out of me. When I thought I'd once again put a distance between myself and what happened, I'd feel the old cold in my throat. Kathy would give me bread. Brandon would sit with me on the porch and say nothing, which was often exactly what I needed. There was no tidy ending. Joe wasn't taken away. There were no legal fireworks. The town kept its history like a bruise. People nodded and kept it to themselves. For months afterward, I swore at every creak in a single-story house. Every time a cupboard thumped, I flinched. Every time a step sounded odd in the night, I would be that person. Locked doors, the phone on my chest, keys in my hand. I learned to set traps for my own imagination, to test my fear against daylight. What stayed with me wasn't the physicality of the attack. The muscles worked, the hands, but the words. She's not going to be happy. He said it like a promise and like a confession, like a sentence someone has practiced in front of an empty mirror until it has shape. And the knowledge that people in that town had for years suspected something about him tightened the space between paranoia and reality into something I could not comfortably pass through. In the dark months that followed, I began to understand a small, terrible truth about winter. It can make you private and sociable in the same breath. It pushes people together into small boxes of light and leaves them there, where all the rough edges show. It hides and exposes at once. I never slept on a stranger's couch again. I never took a porch for granted. I kept company with the people who had saved me and avoided, by practice, if not by law, those who wore their histories like invisible coats. If that felt like the kind of thing that could end any horror I'd ever felt, the next story shows how close the line is between ordinary kindness and something far darker. But before I get to that, if these kinds of true survival stories are the reason you're here, if you want more accounts where weather and people collide and nothing is neat, if that tension pulls at you, subscribe. It helps keep these stories coming. Story 2. The Knock at the Door, upstate New York. I worked from home. My life at the time fit into the rectangle of my apartment, a desk by the window, a pot of coffee that learned my schedule, a small heating system I trusted to hum through the night. The house sat on a quiet road in upstate New York, a place where blizzard warnings were a calendar event rather than a headline. I knew my neighbors at a distance. I knew the town's rhythms. I knew, in general, where to expect snowdrifts and where the plows would miss a turn. The forecast that week was the kind of forecast people use to warn one another. Stay indoors, top up the pantry, the storm is worse than it looks. I taped my windows the way a joke said to, more for ritual than belief, and settled in with groceries and a stack of firewood. The evening thickened into white, and the town's skyline became the silhouette of a row of breathing houses. I locked the doors at dusk and set my phone where I could reach it. Sometime after midnight, headlights sliced across my living room blinds. I saw the sweep of light in brief pulses as a car passed my house and then stopped to stretch down the road. From my kitchen window, I could see someone get out, a silhouette stepping into the snow. A horn beeped intermittently, the sharp staccato sound of a modern animal worried in the dark. The light came back once more, and then a faint knock at the front door. First a single polite rap, then the kind of persistent rhythmic knocking that gathers its own urgency with each attempt. I moved toward the door with a chain on it, small defenses in a house you believe you own. When I opened the door, a sliver with the chain catching, the man at my threshold was coated in snow like a coat of paint. Frost rimed his eyelashes. His hair hid under a hood. He smelled like wet wool and something else, fuel perhaps, or cold metal. He said he was stranded, that his car was stuck, that he needed to get warm and use a phone. His voice was steady in the way practiced liars are steady. There was no quiver, no subtle tremble. It was the voice of a man who had prepared lines for emergencies. There was one thing I noticed immediately. His boots. His boots looked too clean. Not a flake, not a smear, not a wet edge. They were dry and dark as if they'd just been polished in a shop window. Outside, the world around his car was a mess of churned snow. There were wheel tracks and a bank pressed against a doorframe, but no clear path to my porch. If his car had been where he said, his boots should have worn a white halo where he'd stepped through drift. There should have been the grainy, stamped proof of steps between his vehicle and my house, especially if he'd been out for a while. There was nothing. My chain kept me safe at first. I explained I couldn't let a stranger in during a storm. I offered a blanket to some degree as a token. I offered to call for assistance. He smiled in a way that almost looked grateful, but didn't reach his eyes. He started to circle the house, walking along the planked side and toward the back where my kitchen door sat. I heard the scrape of what could be boots along wet wood. Then a hard pound at the back door, 3 bangs, then another, like someone testing wood with a fist to see if it would give. I called 911. My hands shook as I spoke to the dispatcher. My voice had that brittle quality fear leaves, sharp with adrenaline. I told them there was a man at my door who said he was stuck. I told them his boots were clean. I told them he was now banging on the back door. The dispatcher said officers would be dispatched. She asked me to stay on the line, to remain inside, to chain the door more securely. I backed away from the door, my ear glued to the receiver, while outside the knocking turned into a different sort of rhythm, an attempt to be insistent and patient at once. I remember the horn. It started again, far down the road, low and steady. Whoever was out there leaned on the horn as if to keep the world in motion. The man's presence around my house had the effect of making ordinary noises into alarms. The wind sharpened. The house seemed to tilt toward me, as if the walls were leaning to protect me or to quiet me. I watched the front window while I waited. The man moved along the side of the house, and I could see his shape pass by the narrow panes like a ghost that had learned to use edges. Once he paused and looked directly at my kitchen window. For a moment, his face was visible between hood and frost, and he smiled that same small, unreadable smile. Then he motioned, as if trying the back door again. He pounded. The sound was close and full of intent. I did not open. I told the dispatcher where the pounding seemed to be, breath fogging the line, and she stayed on the phone with me while I braced myself. She suggested I stay far from doors and windows. She asked if I had anyone nearby, someone to go to. I said no. She said help was on its way. When I closed my eyes for the briefest second, imagining the patrol lights cutting through snow, something else made me look. There, on the window that faces the backyard, someone had left a smear, not directly on the pane I watched through, but on the little window that sits by my bedroom, where later I would learn there were marks that had no obvious explanation. The smear looked like a handprint, smudged and raw against the glass, fingers splayed as if someone had tried to press to see inside. It was muddy in a way that did not match the clean boots I had seen at the front. Mud that suggested the person had touched the ground somewhere else, somewhere wet and thawing, then climbed up. While I was on the phone, listening to the dispatcher, the pounding and the horn and the scrape of something along my siding continued. I told myself to breathe through it. I told myself the police would arrive soon. I told myself all the rational things that made me sound like someone reading a manual on staying calm. But the man kept moving around the house in a way that suggested he knew my layout or had watched people learn habits. At some point, the knocking stopped. The horn faded into a hollow echo far down the lane. For a dizzy second, I thought the danger had abated. Maybe he had gone. Maybe someone else had found him. Maybe he had gone to someone more foolish. The phone hummed in my hand, the dispatcher asking questions I couldn't answer. I told her I wasn't opening the door. I said I would stay. She told me again that an officer was en route. That was the last reasonable anchor I had. Then there was a noise at my bedroom window, soft, light taps, like fingertips searching for a seam. I could see nothing through the frost, only an impression where someone had pressed. The taps turned into a smear that spread like the hand had been dragged across the pane, a wet streak. I pressed my ear to the glass without thinking, like a child might, to see if I could hear breathing on the other side. I didn't. I heard the wind and my own blood, the police radio distant and intermittent through the snow. I stayed on the phone until I could hear real lights slicing through the snow. Headlights arrived finally, blue and red, not because they had to be dramatic, but because that is what they are. They cut through the weather with a kind of blunt courtesy. Officers got out, boots scraping at the metal doors of their cruiser. They checked the yard and the lane with flashlights like blunt fingers. They dug through drift to where the car had been said to be. They found a vehicle half swallowed by snow on a side road, more than a stone's throw away, buried enough that whoever had tried to move it had left it there out of necessity. But walking from that stranded car to my house should have left a breadcrumb trail of prints, a line of evidence a foot at a time. There were tracks from the car to the road, they said. There were no clear boot prints from the car to my porch. It was the kind of detail that does not sit well with people who like neat patterns. When you give the police a story, they like the math of it. This didn't add up. They called it strange. They called it unusual. They said the man might have used something to cover his boots, might have changed shoes, might have had help. They checked surrounding properties. They knocked on doors that were already closed and warm inside. An officer told me later, slower, careful, that a house down the lane had been broken into during the storm. Nothing was taken, he said. That alone made everyone squint. Theft in the middle of a storm seemed silly unless it had a purpose other than money. I was told to watch for footprints. I was told to take pictures. I was told, in softer moments, that sometimes people do dangerous things in storms and vanish like smoke. They said nothing definitive. They never had. They told me to board up windows and to sleep with my phone under my pillow. They drove away eventually, lights bleeding into the storm. The next morning, sunlight felt like a lie it couldn't keep. The yard was a sculpted thing of whitening piles, and the road a pale gouge. There were no footprints leading from the buried car to my house, not beyond the melted scrapes most boots make when shoving through a drift. There were handprints, though, smeared on my bedroom window where the center glass had frost bitten into the frame. The prints were damp at the time, like something had pressed palms to glass and then left. Someone came later with gloves and took photographs. They catalogued the marks. They wrote notes in a little book that smelled like cardboard. I learned later, this is the part I keep going over, that there was a house not far from mine that had been forced open during the storm. The occupants returned to find a hearth cold and nothing taken. People whispered about the idea that maybe someone was looking for something they couldn't see themselves, maybe a map, maybe a body, maybe a place to die. I don't know. The things people do in storms can be desperate or strangely deliberate. For days I checked the window. The handprints didn't explain boots. The lack of tracks didn't explain the horn. That absence kept me awake longer than the presence did. You can handle someone's obvious hands on your throat. You can even survive. What you cannot handle easily is the way the world will not make sense afterward. They asked me if I'd opened the door. Did I let him in? I told them no. They asked if I'd seen him again. I said no. They missed yet another thing. The way the details lodged in you and wouldn't leave. How could one man with clean boots press his hand to a pane and leave mud on a window while leaving no trace between his car and your house? In the end, they had hypotheses and half-answers. The conclusion was always the kind of thing that allows a police report to close a file without closing a headspace. That night, I slept with the light on and the chain across the door and my phone in my hand. I learned to listen for horns as if they might be a language. I learned to mistrust clean things in a dirty world. For weeks, I checked the perimeter of the property, walking the line of my yard to make sure there had been no tiny rituals missed. I found none. The handprints would remain a mystery, a smear on glass that looked deliberate and yet made no sense without the tracks to accompany it. People came by with questions, with condolences that felt like checks on a list, not real sympathy. Friends asked if I'd move. I said no, because moving felt like admitting a defeat I wasn't ready to accept. And then, weeks after, I heard about another house down the road, with the front door forced. Nothing stolen. The occupants terrified and bewildered. Small towns compress in winter. Every story gets folded into the municipal blanket and pressed down. The pattern made the hair on my neck rise. A knock, a horn, a silence. Prints that don't exist. A hand on a window. Whoever had come to my door had been patient enough to move around the house. Whoever had done the forced entry had been systematic enough to leave nothing taken. There are explanations that make sense. People in panic, mixed up accounts, someone trying to find shelter and leaving an odd mess of details in their wake. There are explanations that don't. The fact remains that when your house is a rectangle against a storm, a knock can be an ordinary request and a threat wrapped in the same breath. And when someone knocks and your sanity demands a reason that fits the world you know, the lack of proof is worse than any proof. I was still on the line with dispatch when the pounding at the back door switched cadence and started again, harder, more insistent. The horn blew down the lane like someone trying to play a distant trumpet, and the snow fell in brittle sheets between me and whatever was outside. My breath hit the glass in white crescents. I moved away from the door and toward the back of the house, to that small bedroom window where the handprint would later show. I pressed my palm to the cold pane in reflex, searching for answer. What I saw through the frost was a shadow that stopped and then moved on. The only thing in the world more precise than that moment of panic. I held my breath as if it had to be kept in me to keep me alive. The horn began again, nearer now, and the knocking took on an urgency that felt like a countdown. The dispatcher told me to stay put. She told me deputies were 2 minutes away, then 5, then 10, numbers meant to steady a pulse. I counted them in my head, like a child learning how to get through something. 1, 2, 3. The snow piled, the house folded in on itself with the sound of wind. And then, at the very second I told myself the police lights would appear, there was a pause, like a held breath on the other side of the wall. The back door's pounding ceased. The horn stopped. Everything held, waiting for a change I couldn't predict. I could feel the floorboards through my socks. My hands were cold enough to make the phone feel like a stone. Through the thin pane of the bedroom window, the world outside looked like a wash of nothing. For a second, I let my eyes go unfocused and imagined a figure moving away into the white. I imagined him walking with clean boots, stomping through packed snow that would erase his steps with a kindness I did not deserve. I stayed on the line until I heard the faraway hum of an engine. Then I heard a different sound, a shout, a command. Then the snow swallowed voices. The rest of it, the officers' sweep, what they found in the yard, the strange small things they catalogued, comes later. For now, all I could do was stand with snow on my porch steps and the memory of a handprint on glass, wondering what had walked up my house in the middle of a storm, and why whatever left that mark had walked away, with its tracks hidden. And in a way that felt like the worst part, the outside didn't look scary afterward, in a way that made sense. It looked indifferent, almost pretty in the clean light of morning. Snow has a way of making horrors look like winter postcards. It smooths edges until everything looks like a photograph. The real ugliness is the memory you keep in your chest. I was still reeling from that when I heard about the mountains, a different white, one you don't expect to be kind at all. The next story takes us from doorsteps to ridgelines, from knocks and hornblasts to something the wind can't quite explain, a hand that helped, then vanished, leaving nothing but a single set of tracks that made no sense. I thought about ending the night there, but the mountain story lingers, and it deserves a shape of its own. I grew up with skis on my feet. For years I could read a line on a slope the way other people read a page. Entry, rhythm, edge, exit. I raced, I taught, later I guided. There's a kind of blind confidence that comes with that life. The idea that if you respect the mountain, you can usually leave it with both legs and a story to tell. I'd taken the proper courses, carried the right gear, and once left the resort for the backcountry, it felt like moving into an older, lonelier language. You learn to listen to the wind the same way you listen to a partner. You learn that a slope's mood can change in a single breath. That day, the weather was a bruise-colored sky that filled from the west and made the light feel thicker than it should have been. I had checked the avalanche forecast that morning, moderate risk, watched the anchors, and I went anyway, the kind of calculated risk that felt reasonable to someone who had skied for a living. The route was familiar, a climb that opened to a long, rolling shoulder and then a descent with a few committing turns. I told a friend where I was headed. I clipped in, felt the snow shift under my skins, and started up into white that smelled like stone. The slide caught me faster than I expected. One moment my skins were biting, the next the surface lost the way it used to hold me. The mountain let go in the way mountains do when their balance tips. An initial crack, a staccato of noise like someone pulling a rug out from under everything. I felt a shove at my back that flipped my world, and then I was tumbling. Not the clean fall you get when you take a bad turn, but the animal roll of being carried. Air and granules plugged my throat. My pack dragged. When the mountain finally spat me out into a pocket of shattered snow, I lay there and tasted metal and cold and pain throbbing where my right leg had taken the worst of it. I remember the pain as a geography. Sharp at the knee, then a deep ache that ran up to my hip. I could move my toes in that dull, testing way you do to see what's left. They answered weakly. My head felt too large for my skull, each breath a work. Around me, the world was compressed to two noises, the wind and a thin, distant creak where a cornice complained. Visibility was bad, whiteness that folded upon itself, and I had no way to move quickly. Every attempt to stand sent lightning through my leg. I sat, propped on an elbow, and checked gear like some mechanical ritual. Beacon on, phone inside the jacket, radio on a channel nobody else was answering. Then I saw him. At first I thought I was hallucinating, an effect of adrenaline, of cold, the mind stitching company out of emptiness. He appeared on the shoulder above me, moving down slowly in that careful, measured way anyone moving on steep, unstable snow must. He was a silhouette at first, then a human with a pole braced in a slow, sure step. He reached me in a few breaths that felt longer than they were. Up close, his features were an odd, flattened thing. Frost framing his lashes, breath steaming like a small animal. He didn't look like a guide or a skier in distress. He looked like someone who had been out there for a very long time. He crouched without asking and looked at my leg like a mechanic seeing a bent chassis. He didn't fumble. He felt for what he needed, tightened a strap on my crampon, shifted my boot with practiced hands. He said simply, "You're screwed if you try to walk." There was no judgment in it, just fact. Then he surprised me with a line I have never been able to unhear. "Haven't used my legs in a long time." It was a small, private thing to say, and it landed wrong in the day. It was all at once a joke, dark and rusty, and a confession. He moved like someone relearning motion, steady but slow, as if the repetition of steps had become something he had to remember how to do. He helped me onto my feet and took my weight as if it were a question. He leaned in, put my arm on his shoulder, and together we put one step in front of the other. Walking out of an avalanche site is like walking through someone else's memory of a storm. Every step you make compresses and slides. My leg proclaimed itself at each contact, a screaming metronome, but he would hold me, say a direction, and then we would move. He kept talking in small bits, a suggestion about route finding, a comment on how the snow had settled weirdly in the lee of a ridge. He was quiet most of the time, the sort of companion you appreciate without needing to fill the air with words. Once, nearly as an afterthought, he asked if I was alone up here. I said yes. He nodded like it was the answer he expected. We moved for a while, maybe long enough that I should have had the chance to see his tracks beside mine. There should have been 2 lines parallel and faithful in the hardpack, but when I turned to look back, almost on impulse, like checking the back seat in a car, I saw nothing but my own trail, my set of prints, a shallow furrow through the wind-compressed snow, and then white that had already started to wash away edges. There were no other ski lines, no extra boot impressions. The impression of being assisted remained in my limbs and in the shape of my memory, but the mountains had not kept the proof. At the ridge, we stopped. I sat on a rock and tried to swallow water. Snow tattooed my jacket and formed little fluting where the wind hit. He stood for a moment longer than necessary, hands on his hips. "You gonna be able to get down?" he asked in that small, flat voice. "I think so," I said, meaning something closer to, "I don't know." He shrugged, then did a thing that has stayed with me. He removed a pair of poles from his pack, then set them aside like a man unstrapping shoes he never used to wear. He touched his own thighs as if testing muscle under cloth, and said the same small line again. "Haven't used my legs in a long time." This time it sounded like both a joke and an apology. I tried to ask his name. It left the world in a tone that felt impertinent. Someone's name in that place seemed too clean. He smiled in a way that did not bring brightness, only the hint of an answer that was not forthcoming. He put a gloved hand on my shoulder, tested my weight one last time, and then, as if leaving a stage, he backed away a few paces and moved like someone receding into film. When I turned fully to thank him, something loud and unnecessary, the air that had held his shape was empty. There was a space where a form had been, only the soft gloss of wind on the snow and the faint erasing marks of what might have been a silhouette. I called to him, which seems silly to admit. I called his name and my voice was little and sharp against the cold. The mountain answered me with a hollow that was not human. I looked at the ridge, at the line where one could fall off into blind white, and then down at my own tracks, a single set, earnest and blotted at the edges by the ongoing drift. No parallel lines traced in the practice of another's skis, no extra scuffs. It was as if I had been alone the whole time, and yet had felt hands I could not admit were imaginary. I made it down a slope at a pace that was more crawl than ski. Each turn was a negotiation. When I hit the road and the flatter snow, a group of hikers met me. They'd seen the avalanche and had radioed that someone might be down. They helped me into a vehicle and drove me to the town clinic where they splinted my leg and wrapped a blanket around my shoulders like an obvious, grateful thing. I answered their questions as best I could and kept folding the episode over in my head. The man, the line about legs, the helping hands, the way my relief had been wholehearted and then curdled into something else when I found no proof. Later, after stitches and x-rays and a too formal conversation with the clinic staff about risk and being alone in the backcountry, I sat with a cup of something tepid and scrolled through a feed on a phone that suddenly felt cheap and intrusive. There was a small local story about an incident on the same range, an earlier trip, a different party, a subject who had not returned from a route and whose body had never been recovered. The article used the language of officialness: missing, search suspended, no remains found. It mentioned conditions, bad enough to cancel volunteers. It mentioned that the area had claimed a life and then left a blank where answers should be. That blank matched the one I had in my chest. I kept telling myself these were two different things. I had been helped. Someone had gone missing at another time. The lines across snow do not care for human patterns, and yet the coincidence lodged like a splinter. Had the man who helped me been connected to that other disappearance? Was he the missing party coming back in some ragged way? Had I seen what can't be explained and been given the wrong word for it? Help instead of harm, a hand instead of a ghost. There were sensible alternatives. He could have been a searcher who bushwhacked without skis, someone who switched to snowshoes out of necessity. Someone could have left that day and taken a different route. My mind, knotted with pain and shock, could have misremembered the tracks. Each explanation fit somewhere, none fit entirely. I do not want to romanticize what happened. I was fortunate. The injury, though painful and limiting, was not life-ending. I walked away with scars that are mostly in my head, but the experience rewired me. I stopped taking solo runs into places where the snow could make me invisible to myself. I started telling people my plan twice over. I learned stubbornly to be suspicious of my own certainty. Where I had once trusted instinct on a slope, I found myself replaying the moments and mapping the gaps. In the months afterward, I paid attention when other people described odd encounters, or when a post circulated from a local rescue team that mentioned an unresolved search. The missing persons file remained open in the ways it does in small communities, because people are pragmatic and cannot emotionally sustain closure for every absence, and because the mountain, appetitive and indifferent, often keeps the last say. I talked to other skiers, to guides, and found the same kind of hush around the subject: respect for the dead, a reluctance to stitch supernatural meaning over a practical tragedy, but also a certain acceptance that backcountry incidents leave folds in the landscape of memory that never quite iron flat. On quiet evenings now, when the forecast turns and the sky glowers, I see that man again, not as a monster or a saint, but as a fact folded into my days. I remember his hands on my shoulder, his line about not having used his legs in a long time, the way he moved like someone relearning motion. I remember the absence where proof would have been, and sometimes, in the small hours, the thought that he could have been a missing man who came back to help someone, like a penitent, or a hallucination from trauma that my body conjured to make fear hold shape, sits like a pebble in my shoe, an irritant you will never quite remove. I learned the same thing I learned in every emergency, that help can arrive from unexpected places, and that sometimes the shapes help takes do not fit the categories your life was built around. I healed in ways that were medical and ways that were merely temporal. My leg mended enough for me to walk without the limp that had made me feel like a different person. But I stopped skiing alone in exposed places. If I go out now, it's with company, with someone who knows a body of habits and who can answer my name from a distance. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a vow written in blood. It was the slow pragmatism of someone who had been handed a narrow miss and decided to treat it seriously. All three stories, Joe in South Dakota, the knock at a house in New York, and the helper on a British Columbia shoulder, share a common thread. The blizzard made normal things strange, and normal orders break down. A door that freezes shut becomes a portal you have to trust someone to open. A knock that would usually mean a simple human courtesy turns into a decision whose consequences you cannot predict. A slope that you have skied 100 times can shed your assumptions like late-season bark. What ties them together is not a logic, but an atmosphere. The whiteout eases the boundaries between inside and outside, between known people and strangers, between the stable ground underfoot and the shifting surface we depend on. In a blizzard, visibility narrows, and so does charity. People move differently when every step is survival. Fear becomes a tool that sorts the world into small, safe boxes and large, unreadable spaces. The images from those nights keep replaying. The house with its front door that wouldn't open, and the neighbor who was suspected of terrible things but never charged. The back door that took hard, purposeful knocks, and the bedroom window stained with a wet, muddy handprint that never got explained. The lone set of tracks on a backcountry shoulder, and a helping figure who left without proof he had ever been there. Each one is a thin, bright thing at the edge of sleep, the handprint on glass, the single pair of ski tracks disappearing into fresh snow, the porch light burning like an eye at the edge of a field. When I drive by that stretch of county road now, my eyes catch on Joe's house even when the world is green and forgiving. When I close my shutters on a winter night, I run my hands over the lock twice. When I strap into a pair of skis, I go with another person. Maybe these are small precautions. Maybe they are the only sensible ones we have when weather is involved. A blizzard doesn't invent the bad in people, but it amplifies it, and it erases the small signs we use to read each other. Footprints, tracks, a neighbor's light. It makes the ordinary thresholds of our lives into liminal places where rules loosen and the unexpected becomes plausible. I can't give you answers. None of these events ended with tidy resolutions. Joe remains a man in a town with a whisper behind him. The person at my door in New York left a handprint that looked like a question and nothing more. The skier on the ridge made me consider whether I had a brush with something that was missing or else floated from a grief I had yet to name. Each story ends with people who survived, and with the uncomforting fact that winter sometimes keeps its own counsel. If you have a story like one of these, if you remember a blizzard that rearranged the world for you, a knock that didn't make sense, a rescue that left questions, put it in the comments. People are listening because these weather walls do not only make headlines, they make lives that tilt. If you want more first-hand accounts of when weather and people meet and nothing comes out simple, subscribe. I put these stories up because the memory of them keeps others gentler and maybe a little safer. And finally, if you ever find yourself on the wrong side of a door in a storm or alone under a sky that wants to cover everything, remember that the rules you carry for ordinary days can fail. Keep your plans known to someone. Trust small lights, and, if nothing else, keep your hands on the glass long enough to see the prints when they appear. Because sometimes the thing that stays with you is a frozen smear on a window pane, a single pair of tracks that don't add up, or a house at the roadside that seems to watch you back. Share this if it struck a chord, and tell me, what did the snow hide from you?